We're going to be in Titus chapter 2 in a little bit. Sometimes the little books may be small in verses, but have a lot to say, and that's what I think of specifically with Titus. There's a lot of emotion involved when I read through Titus. While I was in Memphis, we had to take a Greek class where the teacher wanted us to sight read our Greek New Testament, which I was not very good at. And so all we could have on our desk, and we had 3-hour classes, so we just met once a week. So you just picture this, you have your Greek New Testament, you can't have any notes, and it's you and the teacher in the class for 3 hours, and he'll read to a certain point, and then he'll just say, you know, brother so-and-so or whatever, and you were to translate on site in the class. I sweat so profusely that I wore blue jeans and my basketball socks, and I started at my hip and went down as my pants got wet to my socks, and then started on the inside and hoped that by the time I got to my socks on the inside that the outside had dried off. And my pants were about 4 or 5 pounds heavier after a 3-hour class because he was a Marine and just da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and I was not very good at doing this. But the serendipity of that is that while we were in class, he said, you guys that teach and preach, would you please do me a favor and just take a book and live with it for a year and don't do any teaching out of it whatsoever. And this is where, in talking to Tim, and it's a kind of a gross word, but it's still very applicable, he just said, a lot of teaching is like spiritual bulimia. It just comes in and it goes out, and he said, in 10 years, what would happen if you took a passage from a book and read the book and studied it and didn't do any teaching from it at all for the whole year? So the benefit of having wet jeans and wet socks in his Greek class was that we moved to Australia in 3rd of April, 1979. We're 26 years old. Our son Luke is 9 months. And we move ahead of the rest of our team. And I decided, while I'm here, I'm going to just work with the book of Titus. And Lord willing, we'll talk about a specific couple of verses next week. But seriously, over the next nearly 2 years, then Titus was my companion. And here he is, left on the island of Crete, and I've appointed you, charged you to appoint elders in every city. And then here I've moved halfway around the world at 26 years of age, and Australians are not Cretans, but they are very secular. We moved into our house, and I told Sheila, I don't know what it is, but every time I walk to the store, the neighborhood just vanishes. People either get in their cars and lock the door, they go behind gates, and I said, I can go get milk and move every person in our neighborhood, and they just, I said, it's like Moses parting the Red Sea. And every time I get out, well, we just couldn't, and our neighbors wouldn't talk to us. So here you stop and think. You moved half around the world to try to convert and talk to people, and none of your neighbors will even let you get close to them, literally. Finally, one of our sisters from church worked with our next door neighbor, and she was going on and on about those Mormons who've moved in next door. Did you know that they're committing polygamy, and they have friends over, and they're having brainwashing services and sing songs? And so our next door neighbor has spread to the whole neighborhood, who are just pleasant but secular people. We're the only people who go to church. No one goes to church but us. But the Mormons have moved in, and if the word gets out, the property values are going to go down because the Mormons have established a nest in our neighborhood. Well, when I finally figured out, I told Sheila, I says, I need to buy a bicycle. Sheila said, don't you dare. I said, but wouldn't, now that we know why none of our neighbors will talk to us, that would just kind of fit in with the stereotype. And she said, please do not go buy a bicycle. It took 18 months. The guy who sold insurance across the street from us finally decided that Mormons needed insurance too. And so we bought some content insurance from him. And just before Max left, he said, "Oh, by the way, you folks aren't Mormons, are you?" And I said, "No, we go to church, but we're not." He said, "I didn't think so." And I wanted to say, "Liar, liar, 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 liar." Well, over the next couple of months, Max was kind of the mayor of the street. He spread the word. These are the strangest people we've ever met. And again, give these people a break. The only Americans they know are Mormon missionaries and Dallas and the Dukes of Hazzards on TV. So you do a hybrid of Mormon missionaries, JR and Dallas, and these idiots that jump into a car without opening the door and go, careening up and down the countryside. That was kind of their experience with Americans before they met us. And since we went to church, guess which one of those we fit into? Well, finally, about 18 months later, we went from the leper colony to the chosen children because anyone that knocked on their door, they said, "Mate, you need to go down to number 12. He'll be glad to talk with you." And so anybody that came door knocking that was religious, they now had an excuse, and they would send them to us. And we went from being the people that just could not be tolerated at all. They finally had something to do with anybody who came along. But it really took 2 years for us to get to be able to even just talk to our neighbors. After 4 years, we changed neighborhoods. And if you know Miss Sheila, you'll understand this. We made homemade chocolate chip cookies to take to all of our neighbors. And we'd knock on the door, and here were Heather and Luke with me, and a hand would reach out and take the cookies, and the door would shut. Okay. None of our neighbors would talk to us. The Jehovah's Witnesses in this neighborhood take their kids with them so you won't swear at them when you come to the door. So in our second neighborhood, they spread the word, the Jehovah's Witnesses have moved in. And so our neighborhood's going to go to pot and everything and on and on. And it took about 18 months to kind of get over the fact, and one of our neighbors invited us over for Christmas drinks. I was the only person he knew that didn't drink alcohol. So Greg, think about this. Here you are, a red-blooded male, and you finally met somebody, and Sheila came back for her dad's surgery, and he literally came over and he says, "Mate," he said, "we won't tell her. If you'll come over and have a drink with us, we won't say a word to her." The only thing they could figure out why a red-blooded male didn't drink, it had to be her. And she was halfway around the world, and so you can come and have a drink with us. And I said, "No, I have the genetic propensity to become an alcoholic and all this other stuff." So we were just the weirdest people they had ever met. But finally he said, "You folks aren't Jehovah's Witnesses, are you?" I said, "No, we go to church, but we're not Jehovah's Witnesses." So while all of this is going on, guess who my friend is? Titus. And thinking, okay, you have been left on an island of evil beasts and lazy gluttons and liars. Okay, let me use a stereotype and quickly apologize for this. I have actually known a couple of guys who are members of the church, and I'm sure there are others, and there's probably some here, but I know guys who work in the car industry or are used car salesmen who are Christians. Like, for example, in Childress, Texas, one of the elders ran a used car lot, and people would drive 300 miles to buy a car from an honest elder used car salesman. Having said that, what's the stereotype of a used car salesman? He'll tell you anything to get a sale, and it will either be better or worse than you could ever imagine. And the stereotype of the used car salesman is what I think of when I think of the island of Crete. One of their own poets, Paul says, has said, "Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons." So using that negative stereotype, I'm walking with Titus while I'm trying to get my feet on the ground. We're in a new country and trying to figure out what to do. And I'm thinking, Titus, how are you going to find elders in an island of used car salesmen? What are you going to say to people to help them to be just totally different from the culture around them and help Christianity to make a difference in their lives when the norm is liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons? We're not going to do this in just in a couple of sentences. An earlier Crete culture had been very flourishing, a lot of fabulous economy and things. Things had declined. By the first century, one of the primary things that Cretans were known for were mercenaries. If you're raised in a brothel, you fought all of your life. And the Cretans were mercenaries. They sold themselves to be soldiers for various armies around the world. And so one of the things that people loved about the Cretans is that if you need to hire some guys to fight for you, go hire some Cretans. And then you stop and think, Titus, we're leaving you on home base with this kind of people, and Paul's going to be very specific. I have charged you to appoint elders in every church. So when you look at the purpose statement, I left you on Crete that you might put what remained into order. Another translation says, you might amend what was defective and appoint every elders in town. And here's one of the strongest expressions in the book, as I told you. If you're a young man on the island of Crete, you just think of all the distractions that could be there in terms of all the things that could be said, need to be said, should be organized, straightened out. Here you are in this culture that is in moral decay, and there'd be so much to do. And when I read Titus, I think the young man has probably gotten busy in other things that are good, and then Paul writes this letter, and he's very direct. And as I mentioned earlier when we started with Timothy, Timothy, drink a little wine for your stomach's sake and your often ferments. And when I think of Timothy, I think of timid Timothy. When I think of Titus, I think of tough Titus. One of our dear friends was the defensive coordinator on the Carl Albert football team, and he said, you can see it in a linebacker's eyes. They just walk in and want to hit somebody. And you know exactly what I'm talking about. These are guys on the other side hoping that you come their way. Well, here's timid Timothy, and he's going to speak to him, but when he talks to Titus, it's just going to be right in your face. Buddy, this is what you need to do. Pull your socks up. I left you on Crete. You're actually not doing what I left you to do. I want you to appoint elders in every city. So when you look at this, the verse that we've mentioned is Titus 1 and 12. Cretans, and this is one of their own. This isn't an outsider. Cretans are liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. And so what we're going to do briefly, because we're going to spend the balance of our time at the end on two words that are very important in the book of Titus. But look at what he says. An elder must be able to teach. And if you do older translations from Timothy, the term is an apt teacher. So this is said both in Ephesus and that. He has to be able to handle the word of God. And notice these three things that an elder is going to need to do. He's going to need to give instruction in, and I still love the term sound doctrine, but in my mind I always hear healthy teaching. And think about that. How important is healthy teaching on an island of liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons? And so he's got to know the word well enough that he can use it to give instruction in sound doctrine, to rebuke those who contradict it, and even to silence those who are upsetting whole families. We were working in a church in Oklahoma City and hadn't been married too long. A lot of people come and go. A young man came in who had a physical disability, and I don't disparage that. However, he always wanted to use his disability as an advantage in order to be able to, and I'll use the word manipulate and to do things. And he found a really, really beautiful young lady who she needed someone to mother and he needed a mother, and they were just in a great relationship. And so he was talking to me one day and he said, were you physically attracted to your wife before you had a spiritual relationship with her? And I said, yes. I said, wow. I tried to talk to her 5 times and couldn't get anything to come out of my mouth. I was so smitten. Yes, I had a physical attraction. He said, that's a sin. You should have had a spiritual relationship with her before you developed a physical attraction. He is trying to get my job and wants to have an elders meeting to get me fired because I have a perverted view of love and that I thought my wife was attractive before I had a spiritual relationship with her. What are you going to do, Bill, if someone's moved in the congregation and is trying to get your job and wanting to have the elders to get you fired because you have a twisted view of love? And so we had an elders meeting, and we went through this, and the oldest elder just finally said, and we'll just say brother, he was on one side, this beautiful young lady's on the other side. He said, I want you to hold her hand, reach across the table and hold her hand and say, sweetheart, you're just ugly as a mud fence. Meaning, she's a really pretty girl, but I'm just going to tell you you're ugly, and he wouldn't do it. And the elder just finally said, I think we're happy with the person that we have hired right now. This meeting is over. And what did he do? He just silenced the whole criticism. Sometimes it's a verse, but sometimes it's an ability to deal with people, and you stop and think, how many interpersonal relationship problems are you going to have in a church on Crete? So when it comes to teaching, Titus, you need to find men who give instruction in sound doctrine. They are strong enough to rebuke those who contradict it, and there are times that these people must be silenced. And I'm trying not to be sarcastic, but you can't do it with a stick. And there's a verbal way to do this, and these are to be the men that you're to locate and identify to be bishops and elders on Crete. 2:1, Titus, here's what you're to teach. Teach what accords with healthy doctrine. And you stop and think, how different is a Christian going to be on the island of Crete than all of his neighbors? I've told you this, our son played soccer, and the organizer came to me, and he said, Mr. Hartman, he said, we're really glad you're here, we're really glad Luke is here, but we've done a survey, and in 8 teams, not your team, in 8 teams, your son is the only one who has a Sunday morning commitment. Translated, we were the only ones who went to church on Sunday. How different is our family in a soccer league where we're the only family that goes to church on Sunday? And so, Titus, it's not just to be different, because you can be different and be just as wonky and off the wall and weird as you can be. You're to be different because this is healthy, sound, godly teaching. My dad roped a lot, broke horses, was a jockey. And if you're around guys that work with horses, you'll hear the word sound. And sound, at least when we were with it, had to do with roughly from his knees down through his ankles and to his hoofs. Is he sound? Is he good? And we had a lot of rocks. And my granddad would buy a horse with 1 white hoof, but once it passed 2 or 3, he wouldn't buy it because they're softer than the others. And for years, we had the most klutzy, we just called him start, stumble, and fall. And you would just ride him, and his just front leg would just go down, and you'd get whiplash when he came back, and you just held your breath every time. He wasn't sound. And so when I hear the word sound doctrine, it's the things that are healthy. It's the things that both are good and good for you. So let's stay with Titus. Older men, sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled, healthy in faith, in love, and steadfastness. And again, how different are they going to be than the stereotype of the average Cretan? Older women, reverent, not slanders, not slaves to much wine, and they are to teach what is good. And then here comes the transition. Train the younger women to love their husbands and children. Let me go ahead and finish this. Be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind, submissive to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be reviled. And then look at this. Urge young men to be self-controlled. I'm at a college seminar, and these are just people off of the Memphis State campus, and the book of Titus was being taught, and it came this section, and you could tell where this girl was coming from. She raised her hand, and she said, I knew that Paul was against women. And the teacher said, how come? She said, look at all the stuff that he told the girls to do, and then he gives the guy one thing. And she read the list while she was standing up. Love your husbands, love your children, be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind, submissive to their husbands. And then he tells the guys one thing. You can guess this made everything better. He said, sweetheart, you girls are so far ahead of these knot-headed boys at this age. If we can just get them to do one thing, we really have a moral victory. If they'll just stop and think before they act, that would change their whole world. And then he said, and you've dated some of these knot-headed boys who haven't developed a brain yet. And so he said, Paul wasn't against women. He just knew at this stage of life the girls were just capable of a lot more things than these knot-headed boys were. And if we could get the guys to just stop and think before they act, if they do that one thing, that would just change their whole lives. Well, she blew a fuse, as you can imagine, but I laugh every time I come to this. But look at these domestic household things that are there. Very important, and here are traits that will develop a strong family. Titus, show yourself to be a model of good deeds. Show integrity, dignity, sound speech that can't be condemned. Bondservants, be submissive to your masters. Be well-pleasing, not argumentative, not pilfering, word for stealing. Showing good faith, so that in everything they may adorn the doctrine of God. Look at these three things. The healthy doctrine, sound teaching, so that the word of God will not be reviled, verse 5. An opponent may be put to shame, have nothing evil to say about us, and that we may adorn the doctrine of God. We all got dressed to come to church today. And what he's saying is that in our behavior, in our life, the same way that we get dressed by wearing clothes, we are able to adorn and put these teachings on in our lives. Look at the terms that are used on the back of the page for Timothy and Titus. Timothy 1, my true child in the faith. Timothy 2, my beloved child. Titus, my true child in a common faith. And when you look at the word true, the word legitimate is also a part of this. Scripture is silent if Paul had any family. We know he has a sister because his sister's son heard about the attempt to kill him in Jerusalem. So we know that side of the family. We know he's from the tribe of Benjamin, but we do not know personally if he married. Nothing is said. Our assumption, since nothing is said, is that he's probably not. But do you remember what Jesus said? No one has left father and mothers and fields and families and all this stuff, but they'll have these and many more things in this present age. Assuming that Paul doesn't have physical sons, these two guys are his spiritual sons. And one of the wonderful things about the church is that sometimes in our church family we have bonds of relationship. And do you remember what Paul said to Timothy? You treat the older men like fathers, the older women like mothers, younger men like brothers, younger women like sisters with all purity. Treat the church like your family. And what I love about these two guys is that, assuming he doesn't have a physical family, then these guys function very much in his life as his sons. I still laugh about this. When Dane Berkey was being interviewed to come be our intern, and this is a fair question. Tim was talking to him, and Tim said, well, there's a new guy on hire, and his name's Dale, and you'll be working with him. And Dane just says, well, what if we don't get along? That's a good question. Well, you'll probably think, well, while he was here, you couldn't have hurt him if you wanted to. I'd walk by and just whack him hard as I could and says, dang, how are you and that new guy getting on? Been having any trouble with that new guy? A relationship over a period of time, he becomes like a son. And so now that he's working in a new church, we can have a 45-minute conversation on a whole different level about what's going on in his ministry than even that we could while he was working here as an intern. And that's exactly what's going on with Paul and Titus. Now that you're on the field, here's some things that you need to do. Timothy, set the believers an example, and you'll see this in chapter 4, 12 through 16. Titus, show yourself in all respects a model of good deeds, and in your teaching, integrity, dignity, sound speech that can't be condemned. You're going to have a lot of criticism. You're going to have a lot of opponents, and you get the chance to kind of set the pace by the example of your life. I want to do something very quickly, and this will be something that we'll do a couple of times. Every time I read a book, I literally photocopy, I call the opening the front, and I copy the back. And there's something that said, something that is involved with God. And what we've noticed is that in the book of Titus, God doesn't lie. Remember the old manual typewriters, ding? And I'm reading along one day and I'm thinking, oh, but what are Cretans? Liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. And one term is brought down to be the foundation for the book of Titus. The character of God is that he doesn't lie. But then when you look at what people are called to do, the knowledge of the truth, which is according to godliness. And godliness is a term for a spiritual lifestyle. Godliness is a term for people who walk with God. And when you read the very end of the book, and we're going to look at these briefly in a minute, Christians are called to be people who are devoted to doing good things. And here's what's important. We're not saved by our good works, but we are saved in order to live a life of good works. And that's a very important distinction. And as Christians, well, let's do it this way. As people are called out of the darkness into the light, and as gradually they come out of this Cretan culture, then the doing of good things is going to be one of the most important things that is going to be stressed for them. There's two words that we're going to kind of focus on. The first one is the word agathos, and anyone who's done mystery reading, her name is Agatha Christie, and this is a word for good. The second word that's used for good is kolos, K-O-L-O-S, and you'll hear our words calligraphy, calisthenics. My grandfather had a penmanship class in the early 1900s. And every time he stopped, he did, and he'd been trained. You take a deep breath, you get your handwriting on, and his handwriting just flowed. It was beautiful. It was calligraphy. What's calisthenics? For someone to have a stronger, beautiful body. In case I don't get to it at the end, just let me do this real quick. I mentioned this while Tim and Callie were in a Wednesday night class in Sydney. Simultaneously, father and daughter both get on their phone and Google Callie. And guess what Callie means? Beautiful, attractive, lovely. And she is so much like her dad. And without even looking at each other, she got to thinking, oh, I didn't know that's what my name meant. And so kalos is this word we get Callie, calligraphy, and calisthenics from. So we're going to do this in a couple of ways, but on the left, at the bottom, are the terms for agathos, and this is something that's good in its result. An overseer is a lover of good. These people are detestable. They can't do anything good. Teach younger women to be pure workers at home. Good, some translations will say kind. 2:10, bondservants, showing all good faith. 3:1, Christians are to be ready for every good work. And then the loving kindness is another word for good. So those are words for good. And notice, and we'll see this when we turn the page, here then become the words that have to do with kalos. Older women teach what is good, 2:3, 2:7, Titus, be a model of good works. 2:14, be zealous for good works. 3:8, devote themselves to good works. These are excellent and good, 3:8, and learn to devote themselves to good deeds. So if you turn to the back page, I just did these linear. Look at the thread that runs all the way through the book of Titus. Not only does God doesn't lie, but God's people are called to a life of godliness. And here are two different types of good. And let me just do the bottom line on them. The things that are agathos are the things that have a good result. When we had a sore throat, my grandmother would squeeze some raw onion juice and take a cotton swab and swab the back of your throat as far down as she could, and she'd say, "Now, son, this is good for you." If you had other problems, she would give you some castor oil and a little bit of Dr. Pepper, and she would say, "This is good for you." If your innards weren't quite working, you might get a little sip of kerosene. She had been a midwife for 20 years, and all the kids in this school she had delivered. And when your grandma said it's good for you, it may not have had any medicinal value, but you either didn't want to tell you were sick or it helped you to get well, just wanting not to have to do this again. That's agathos. Kalos, calligraphy, wow, that's good. So what Christians are called to do is to be involved in a lifestyle of where they manifest good things. And we won't be able to do all of these, but just look at the definitions for good. Agathos, a high standard, what is significant and of good worth. You go halfway down the page, an elder is a lover of good. What a wonderful quality. Also, the goodness and loving kindness of God, our word anthropia, philanthropy is the term that's there again, doing things that are good. Kalos, something that is beautiful and good, like the Good Shepherd. Turn to the back page. There are several of these that I'll let you read, but I just want to finish with this part on the bottom because there's some helpful things here. Do you remember when Jesus taught the lesson that the evil spirit was in the house and he left? And look at those words. The house was empty, it was swept, and it was clean. And what did the evil spirit do? He came back and brought 7 with him, and the end was worse than the other. When I read Titus, what I see is that Paul is saying, guys, we want to fill the house with good things. We want to do things that are good and are helpful, and we also want to do things that even the heathens look at and say, wow, that's really, really good. How do you eventually get to talk to a neighborhood who won't meet you at the street? Well, you can imagine with my wife, you share food with them, you help them with their kids, you do things, and you try to do things that are helpful in order to get to know them. When our son went to school for the first day, we didn't find this out till later, but non-Christian Cheryl went home and told Mike, she said, I didn't get to meet her today, but I watched how this lady treated her son on the first day of school, and I'm going to sign up with her and do class activities so I can get to meet her because I was so impressed with how she treated her son on the first day of school. Kalos. And see, even people who didn't go to church can recognize a mother's genuine love for her son, and eventually we get to teach that lady the gospel. People are watching us all the time. And Titus is encouraging us, whether it's things that have a good result, even if they're hard, Agatha, or it's something that everybody just looks at and says, boy, that's a really good thing, then the island of Crete with liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons, godliness that manifests itself in a lifestyle where people are committed and dedicated to doing good things. I said this at the bottom. I heard this from my grandparents. An idle mind is the devil's workshop. Well, the gospel changes lives, and what Paul is going to say to the people who are on Crete, devote yourselves. Be committed, be focused. I don't like the term, but it's actually in the idea. Be addicted to doing good things. And what happens if the house is already full of good things? Satan has so less opportunity to come in and have a part of it. And so, here's the final things. These are excellent and profitable for people. We are to help people in cases of urgent need and not be unproductive. And I'd like to encourage us to fill our lives with things that are agathos, that are done, that are good regardless of the consequences, and things that are beautiful, so we also can fill the house full of good things in our lives as well.